Good afternoon, everybody. It's so happy to have you here today to talk about the literary references that have been embedded in Doctor Who across the decades. And I think it really is one of the things that makes Doctor Who fandom so special for me, because you have to be smart to get it, right? And to notice those little moments. And there are moments I didn't notice myself, but sometimes you'll see something happen and you'll think, that comes from somewhere, and I need to go figure out what that is. And so that is how I built this talk. I thought of the phrases that I recognized from literature, and then I started just doing a little research on what are some books that I think they probably mentioned, but I don't remember, and it came up with many things that had never occurred to me, and that's what always makes it so interesting. So this is from Shakespeare to Shelley, and I felt like using the little cartoon pictures because I thought they were cute and fun, or from Dante to Dickens. All names we've heard of, but not necessarily things many of us have studied for a long time. I can't say that I've sat down and read Dante recently, but long ago and far away, somebody made me do part of it. And it's fun to look at how that affected things. So I'm calling this the first meeting of the Doctor Who Book Club, because really, one could choose many books from being introduced to them or to their authors through Doctor Who. And again, I think that's something, as they tried to teach history, they also taught us literature in a way that maybe children will pick up a book because they heard this person was someone that the Doctor met. And I think that's one of the contributions that the show makes. Again, I've said this before. Y'all know who I am. I've done Touched by an Angel. I've been part of different TV shows from Beverly Hills 90210 and what have you. And then I worked with Written by Magazine, which is the magazine of the Writers Guild, and had the great joy, I've got a copy it over there, of getting to interview Russell Davies when he was in Los Angeles to do the 4th season of Torchwood. And just sitting in a room with him, and when he realized I was not just a journalist, but a fan who knew things, there was a PR guy who I was only supposed to get a half an hour. And we were in this glassed office talking, and the gentleman walked by the door, and I knew he was coming to say, your time is up, and Russell waved him off, because he was having a good time talking to someone who actually cared about what he did. So I think that's quite fun. And then I've written a bunch of books as I'm a professor. My latest one on Doctor Who is the one about Jodie Whittaker's time. I have a chapter in that. Then I also have a book up there on Shonda Rhimes' work, because I have a chapter in that. It's the newest thing I've done. This is a new book series from Bloomsbury called Screen Storytellers. And they're doing a set of famous writers from television. And funny enough, I was so busy on the Shonda Rhimes book, and I'm editing a book on Susan Harris, who did Soap and the Golden Girls, that I didn't have time to write chapters in the 2 upcoming books on Russell Davies and Stephen Moffat. But one can look to Bloomsbury and find those books come out. They're like $20, but they're going to be quite fun because they'll be deep looks at the writers that we enjoy. So that's who I am. Again, this is the book I just mentioned, my latest Doctor Who contribution. But we want to talk about the literary references that we find in this show that we love so much. For me, trying to think about all of them, I went back as far back in Doctor Who as I could, and the first thing I found was this great moment from the Jon Pertwee era. Now, this is an Italian, first of all, because Dante was famous for being the first novel written in the Italian language, not Latin or one of the more important Greek languages. It made Italian a legitimate language. And so in Italy, of course, Dante is quite revered. So, lasciate ogni speranza voi centrate, means abandon hope, all ye who enter here. And this is the line that Dante says when he enters purgatory, and he has to move through hell as he's traveling, trying to find Beatrice, his great love. So Dante's Inferno is the first of 3 books that Dante wrote, all about this adventure that he as a character, Dante, had traveling through hell. And it's the reason, I went too fast. Notice how I highlighted the phrase human nature, because he was learning the consequences of human nature, which as a Doctor Who fan made me go, oh, sidetrack. Remember that episode called Human Nature? Really well done. Starred Thomas Brodie Sangster as a young boy. We know him from going on to doing, what's the movie with Emma Thompson? No. Oh, Nanny McPhee, that's true. But the love movie with her and Hugh Grant and Alan Rickman. Love Actually. He's the little boy in Love Actually. All About the Boy. And that's the other one. But before you leave him, you've got to watch The Artful Dodger on Hulu. This is the best new miniseries in my book. He plays Dodger grown up. And in Oliver Twist, there's a bit where it says eventually the Dodger was caught being a criminal and sent away, which means they would have sent him to Australia. So in this reimagining, He went there, he met a surgeon on the ship who saw that as a pickpocket he was good with his hands, so he trained him to be a surgeon, and he shows up in Australia and nobody knows he's supposed to go to jail in Australia because the surgeon died. So he becomes a surgeon in like the very early days of surgery in Australia. He falls in love with a woman who's the daughter of the governor, who wants to be a surgeon, but who's going to let a woman do that back in the day. And then she discovers that to make money on the side, he's still a criminal. So she blackmails him into teaching her how to do surgery. And it becomes their love story. And Fagin is played by David Thewlis, who comes to us from Harry Potter. So I highly recommend this as a piece worth watching. It's on Disney and it's on Hulu. Back to Dante, all right? So Dante, as I said, Beatrice is begging the Virgin Mary to send Virgil, the philosopher, to help Dante get through. And what we know Dante mostly for, which we've seen in video games and other movies and all of that, oops, I went too fast, is the 9 circles of hell. So this piece of literature is what taught us to talk about hell as this real space, right? And these basically are the 7 deadly sins, right? So we have limbo is the place where you go if you died before you knew Christ. So all the philosophers in Greece and all those guys, they can't go to hell. It's not their fault they couldn't go Christian because, right, he hadn't existed yet. So you kind of meet all them in there. But then all the people who committed sins show up in the different levels, and their penalty is worse and worse and worse as you go. And all of this comes from the mind of Dante, right? This is all his invention, which I think is very cool. So when you think about it, people often talk about, oh, you belong in the 6th circle of hell, and these phrases come from this very ancient book. Which I think is cool. But then we have Dr. Nine, who met Charles Dickens. But in The Unquiet Dead, there are no Dickens quotes, which made me go, how do you do that? How do you not do that? All right, fine. But Dickens is going to show up. Then in the Christmas Carol episode, there's no quotes from the Christmas Carol. They're using the whole piece, but they're not giving us any extra quotes. We're like, okay, whatever. Turns out it's Dr. Six who gives us an actual quote. It's a far, far better thing I do than I have ever done. It's a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known, right? So, of course, he's riffing on A Tale of Two Cities and Sidney Carleton from that book. So I was like, oh, very interesting, okay. And I was kind of happy to find a little bit of all the different doctors as I go through this. I also try always to note the names of the writers of the different episodes, because, of course, to me, it's very important who did that. It means these are the people who knew these stories and wanted those to be embedded in their stories. So I think that's very cool. I had never actually heard of Pip and Jane Baker, and now I feel I need to go research them because they were a married couple who wrote television in England at that time, and I've never heard of them. So I'm dying to find out what the rest of their career is like. I may talk about them next year. I don't know.
Would be fascinating. Yes.
That would be really fun. Then another quote that we get from Dickens comes to us from lots of people's favorite doctor. I happen to be a Peter Davison girl, but I totally get Tom. I totally understand that. And this actually came from Doctor Who magazine. So here's a guy who knows his classic literature. It just comes off the top of his head in a normal conversation. And in this case, again, he's quoting Oliver Twist. There's a passion for hunting something deeply implanted in the human breast. And he's describing acting and the adventure of finding a character and deciding what you're going to bring to a script that's given to you. And I thought that was so beautiful. We find that often in English actors. They're so steeped in the classics that these phrases come off the top of their head in ways that maybe not necessarily we do here. But that's okay. The fun sidetrack of that, of course, is Oliver Twist, right? I'm telling you about the grown-up Oliver Twist. Don't miss that. But it had led then to the musical of Oliver, which many people have seen one way or another. And that leads me to a sidetrack. On Broadway, guess who starred as the Artful Dodger? A little boy who grew up to be a monkey. Yeah. Which was the first book that I did, was the History of the Monkeys TV show. And that's how they found Davy Jones to put him in the Monkeys. And of course, then we know he moved on to the Brady Bunch, which is the most watched episode of rerun television ever. That one episode of the Brady Bunch. Is that hilarious? And then he went on to Sabrina the Teenage Witch and a million things. But I love the fact that he started on Broadway as the Artful Dodger, right? And did you know there's a new TV show called Dodger, which stars a guy we recognize as Fagin. So Eccleston, beyond Doctor Who, has done many things, including this show, which is also, I believe, on Hulu right now. So again, we're so steeped in these stories that keep being rebooted in different ways. I didn't know until I did some research that when they invented the character of Adric, they were inventing a Dodger character for the Doctor. That's who he was meant to be molded over, which I thought was very cool.
So how do you get a mathematician
Out of a pickpocket, well, that's it. He was a very specialist in Oliver Twist, and here that was his specialization. And we're not going to highlight for a children's show a criminal, so we're going to highlight a nerd. Which makes sense, because who watches Doctor Who except us nerds? Let's admit it, right? So I had not known that before I was researching all of Oliver Twist's involvement in Doctor Who. And that led me to thinking about Earthshock. Oh, where'd it go? Now that's funny. Oh, that's funny. They're on my screen, but they're on here. Earthshock, of course, is the episode where we lose Adric. Spoiler alert, in case you haven't seen old Doctor Who, that happens sometimes.
No, never know.
But this phrase, "I'm going outside, I may be sometime," was said by the Peter Davison Doctor after when Tegan and Nyssa were saying, "Let's go back and save him." And he has to explain that that can't happen in the way time works in Doctor Who. So when he realizes he's depressed and he can't fix things, he's going to go outside of the TARDIS and walk around. And I was like, that seems like a quote from somewhere, but I don't know it off the top of my head. Let me research that. It turns out it comes to us from English history, which is, of course, in a book form. This gentleman, Captain Lawrence Oates, was part of Robert Falcon Scott's exploration trying to get to the South Pole. And sadly, all of the men on this expedition died. What happened was 2 of them had passed away. They were far too far from where they'd left their food sources, and they kept trying to move, but the storm was so terrible that at a certain point, Captain Oates started to get frostbite. And he knew that he was not going to make it, and he thought he was holding up his friends. So at first he said, "Leave me here, you go on." And they were all like, no, we can't do that. We're all going to do this together. So they spent the night sleeping in their tent. And when they woke up in the morning, Captain Oates said, "I'm stepping outside, I may be sometime." And he walked into the storm himself to his death to save his friends. Sadly, in a few days, all the friends had died as well. But this is embedded in English history and therefore in some literature that as Americans we weren't necessarily going to recognize. So that was one of those moments watching Doctor Who. I was like, you're telling me something extra that I'm missing, that I want to know about, which I love. Of course, we've also heard this phrase, and it was interesting that we heard it several times on Doctor Who. I thought only in the Peter Davison era, again, because that's what I've seen a lot of. But I went back and found in Patrick Troughton's era as well, they had reasons to say something is such stuff as dreams are made of. Which makes us think of where most Americans heard this would have been in The Maltese Falcon, which was written by Dashiell Hammett and then turned into a film, starring Humphrey Bogart, of course. And at the very end, they've all been looking for this falcon. And when somebody says, "What was this in the end?" he says, "The stuff that dreams are made of." And I thought, well, there you go. It comes from Dashiell Hammett. I'm done. Except a little extra research told me, no, it doesn't. It comes from The Tempest. It's a Shakespearean quote that we get because, of course, everyone knows The Tempest in England. Again, we're not all up on a Shakespeare. But what I love about this is, guess who starred as Prospero? He starred as a young man in The Tempest and then again as an older man. And we know him, of course, as the Master. So Derek Jacobi is just an amazing talent that we've had the chance to experience in Doctor Who. But all of this comes from The Tempest. My fun sidetrack, if you've never seen I, Claudius, exactly, he's brilliant in this as a very young man, and they age him all the way up. And of course, some people don't know Patrick Stewart's in it as well. That's one of his first acting jobs. It's I know he has hair, isn't that funny? Where did he get all that hair? And
It's a toupee.
a lot of people don't know that I, Claudius is the design behind The Sopranos. Because if you think about The Sopranos, he has a mother who's always bothering him and forced him, or he thinks, into being a gangster to follow his father's footsteps. So when they created The Sopranos, they were just making a modern-day version of I, Claudius.
Even the mother's name
Is Livia. Yes, she's Livia in I, Claudius, and she's Livia in The Sopranos. So again, amazing to me how one piece of literature, something somebody read as a child, keeps foundationally reappearing in their work.
Clueless and Emma.
Exactly. Exactly. That's exactly right. So I think that's very cool. But getting back to our Tempest, guess who's also played Prospero? Because they did an all-female version of it. I had no idea. I had no idea that Alex Kingston played Prospero on the stage, at the Royal Shakespeare Company, as did Helen Mirren. And of course, there we have Patrick Stewart again. Keeps appearing in, things. Tangentially, I don't know when he's going to appear on Doctor Who, because he seems to always be right around the orbit of it, but not quite in it. Maybe we can't imagine seeing Captain Picard with the Doctor. I don't know, that might be too much of a cross. But I think it was amazing. Again, the fun stuff you discover when you go a little bit deeper. Now I want to see if I can find some footage of her version of Prospero. I think that would be quite fun.
It is always funny to see that you've got Jean-Luc as the memes. Oh God, we almost hit a Time Lord.
Exactly. We blend the two. The two fandoms are very well tied, definitely, because they're both positive versions of science fiction, right? And there are far too many apocalyptic versions. We need more of the positive version. So that's why I think those have such power. But I love the fact that they're all tied up. Yeah. So of course we have to bring ourselves to Shakespeare, because clearly Shakespeare has appeared often, right, in Doctor Who. This is one of the posters a friend gave me a while ago that I love. All the words and phrases that Shakespeare invented. He would just make words up and put them in his pieces, and then they became modern words, right? And we find ourselves using them. Things like watchdog, things like what the dickens, right? Things like, he even said, every dog has his day. So the amazing vocabulary that he added to our world, and certainly he adds a lot to Doctor Who. We all know the Shakespeare Code, right? A really good episode, but I don't have to talk about that yet, because Shakespeare has been quoted inside Doctor Who, again, across the eras. For me, it starts here in The State of Decay, written by Terrence Dicks. I like to credit the writers all the time. But this particular piece, the odds are almost insurmountable. But he who outlives this day and comes safe home shall stand a tiptoe when this day is named and rouse him at the name of E-Space. The E-Space things makes us giggle, which it should, right? We always have fun with Doctor Who. This comes to us from the St. Crispin's Day speech in Henry V, right? And it's basically the same thing, except it's not E-Space, right? We're going to rouse him at the name of Crispin, which I think is very cool. Then I had to say to myself, wait a minute, do Americans know what St. Crispin's Day is? Let's go look at that. Let's figure that one out. Well, it's based in the Battle of Agincourt, which was the English against the French in the 100 Years' War. And the English were wildly outmanned. They should have lost, but they screwed up their courage, as they say, and they won the day. And it happened to fall on what was, or still is, in the calendar of saints, St. Crispin's Day, all right? Exactly, right? And so all of this means so much in English history that it keeps popping up. Again, there have been film versions of Henry V as well. And so you can see lots of actors giving this speech online. But I love that we saw it in Doctor Who, in State of Decay, right? In that little twisted version. And of course, we have to come to Macbeth. There's always some stuff from Macbeth. And we just read that there's going to be released in theaters. So we'll be able to see it here. We'll be able to buy tickets and see it in our local cinemas, which I think is very cool. Yes, obviously. In Capaldi's era is when he quoted from Macbeth. And makes sense, the Scottish doctor should quote from the Scottish play, right? But I thought it was very interesting to then suddenly realize that David, who we know has done Hamlet, is now about to do Macbeth as well. So I definitely want to go see that. Yes. Actually, I like the fact that this episode was written by Mark Gatiss, right, who we all recognize from the Lazarus Experiments, and we know that he's written on Sherlock and all these other things. But he has this beautiful piece, which is not from anybody else's book. I sometimes think it's amazing the quality of writing on this show, that we end up with memes and things that people quote again and again. And this one I thought was just very beautiful because it was about the importance of sleep, right? Sleep isn't just a function, it's blessed. Every night we dive deep into that inky pool, deep into the arms of Morpheus. That's just very poetic. And it's just Mark Gatiss, a modern day writer. But when you let people loose and they have the background of this kind of vocabulary and language in their brain, this is what they come out with. Now, let us get to the Shakespeare Code because, of course, we know there's a lot of quotes in this. And it was almost too many, but it was fun to go through every single, because that was the joke they were playing, right? Certainly at one point, and what's cute in this episode, of course, is that David keeps saying things And then the Shakespeare character goes, oh, I should write that down. He's like, yes, you should, right? So clearly the doctor is seeding all these ideas. And then Martha gets a couple, and I think it's quite cute. Yes, the doctor does say all the world's a stage, and it comes from all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players, which we hear often in many places, right? Comes to us from As You Like It. Of course, we just said Hamlet. So both he uses to be or not to be, and the play is the thing inside this piece. And as I said, we all know that David then also did a version of it. And guess who was in his version of Hamlet? Patrick Stewart shows up everywhere. I think that's very fun. Now,
Is that bad penny?
yeah, there you go. He's not Moneypenny, he's the bad penny. Also, of course, in the Shakespeare Code, they use another quote from Henry V. Once more into the breach, dear friends, once more. Right? Which I think is a very cool quote. It concludes with a couple of lines that we're familiar with. The game's afoot. The game's afoot, follow your spirit, and upon this charge, cry God for Harry, England, and St. George. And I thought to myself, well, clearly that comes from Arthur Conan Doyle. They're quoting him, right? No, that appears in Henry V. So Doyle is quoting Shakespeare. It's being quoted by Gaddis inside this. Just the layers of who's quoting who, right? And moving these ideas and these words into next generations, right? There are kids who haven't read any Shakespeare who know these lines from Doctor Who, which I think, again, makes the show so precious. He also quotes Sonnet 18, shall I compare thee to a summer's day, in describing Martha, which is a beautiful way to talk to a woman, right? And this comes to us, and she listens to it, and she knows it, but not as perfectly as she would like to. But it's beautifully done, I think, as it's given here. David also throws in the word Sycorax, which ends up appearing in The Tempest, and is, of course, a villain that we see in Doctor Who several times across the eras once it's been implanted in the Christmas Invasion, which of course was David's first episode. So I thought it was pretty cool to see on stage when they do a Sycorax versus what the costume people created for the episode. Very cool. But they make a big joke. He says the word and then Shakespeare says, that's a great idea. It's like, no, it's a real thing, but never mind. Now, it's not just Shakespeare that was quoted in the Shakespeare Code. Right? They make a joke about rage, rage against the dying of the light. Anybody know who that belongs to? I know, that's you. Good job, Dylan Thomas. That is a Dylan Thomas quote. Right? And so at one point the doctor says that is Shakespeare, so I'm going to write that down. He says, no, that belongs to somebody else. They're so busy quoting funny things. It's like, wait, no, you can't have that one.
You're Scottish, but you can't use it.
You can't use it, exactly. But I think it's really beautiful because, again, it's one of those very pretty things, right? The wise men at their end know dark is right because their words had forked no lightning. They do not go gentle into that good night. Beautiful. Beautiful stuff. Sidekick, if you haven't seen Staged, which is now, I believe, all on YouTube, this stars David and Michael Sheen. They did it at the beginning of the COVID pandemic because they were supposed to do a play and they couldn't rehearse, so they were meeting on Zoom with the director. And it's quite a fun piece. There's 3 seasons to it. Eventually, both their wives get involved in it. Judi Dench shows up in it, all of this stuff. And it's the two of them pretending they're mad at each other when we know they're very good friends. So I think it's quite lovely. And it comes from the fact that if we have time in the end, I'm going to show you a clip of Michael Sheen doing that poem. And it's quite beautiful. So, but I want to make sure we get to the end, so we will. Also within the Shakespeare Code, Martha references the butterfly effect, which is if you step on a butterfly and you might, some small thing will change the future. And so there's the fear of what's going to happen. I myself did not know that it comes from a Ray Bradbury book. He invented that idea in The Sound of Thunder. So again, we have Dylan Thomas, we have Shakespeare. Yeah, I mean, pretty cool, all within the confines of this one episode. Very cool. Also, she's got a reference. They have to make a Harry Potter joke. So they do, right? He's asking Martha to say something important to stop the witches, and that's all she can think of. Is the American version of an English story that is so embedded in young American children. So I thought it was quite fun that she did that. But of course, they have the little buried, oh, by the way, and David was in the Harry Potter movie series, right? So we're intertwining all of these stories. They're all infecting each other, which I think is quite fun. Now, this then brought me to Robot of Sherwood, which doesn't have any quotes because there are many versions of the Robin Hood story. There is not one person's Robin Hood book, which is the thing we read over and over again. It's been reimagined in different ways. It's been rewritten by different people, including Disney, as we know, the Fox Robin Hood. But I love this exchange at the end of it, and I think it's another example of really great writing, and oh my gosh, it's from Mark Gatiss. Clearly, this guy is pretty brilliant. But if you remember it, it's the lovely piece where Robin Hood is asking, will I be remembered as a man or a legend? And then at the very end, he gets around to saying, Clara told him the story of the doctor. And he basically says, but I'm not a hero, right? Because the doctor would never, like, no, don't give me any credit for that. And I love that Robin says, well, neither am I. But if we both keep pretending to be, perhaps others will be heroes in our name. Perhaps we'll both be stories. And may these stories never end. Remember, Doctor, I'm just as real as you are. Which I think is so lovely. I was so impressed when I saw that. So again, not from any particular book, but Robin Hood himself comes to us. Spoon, exactly. Yes. We made that joke earlier today. Because over there I have a sonic spork right there. All right, and of course you knew The Haunting of Villa Diodati had to come up because here we're going to get into the Shelley Byron world. So here we have Percy Bysshe Shelley. And again, I like the cartoons, but this is the actor who played him in the piece, and I think quite lovely. Here we get bits from his work, right? So there's not one atom of yon earth, but once was living man, the sword that stabs his peace, he cherishes. The snakes that gnaw his heart, he raises up the tyrant whose delight is in his woe. And we're having this exchange, the Cyberman gets to be all literate, which is kind of weird. It comes from this book, Queen Mab, which I had not heard of myself. And this is the exact quote, that there's not one atom of yon earth, but once was living man, nor the minutest drop of rain that hangeth in its thinnest cloud, but flowed in human veins. Very beautiful stuff, very beautiful stuff. We find that Shelley gets quoted in The Timeless Children by Chibnall. He's got a moment where he says, look upon my work, Doctor, in despair. And that's the master, of course. One of my favorite masters. I wanted to see more of him. But this comes to us from a poem that Shelley wrote, Osmandius, which is all about seeing the statue of Ramses II and thinking about what happens to someone years and years later. Right? What happens to their legacy? When they've left this earth after all that they've done, will people remember them? And clearly Shelley's thinking about himself and will people remember his work? But I thought that was really very pretty. Interestingly enough, on Shelley's own tombstone, almost forgot the word, he had a quote from The Tempest that he wanted people to remember him. Nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. And he pulls that from, so we've got Shelley borrowing Shakespeare, and we've got Shelley and Doctor Who, and we just go in little layers and layers and layers. When I think of Shelley, though, I have to do a little side trip into Margaret Fuller, who's an American writer. She was a member of the Transcendentalists, and she worshipped Shelley's work, and she wanted to be as good as he was. She followed the fact that he moved to Italy. Of course, they all traveled to Italy at one time. So she did that as a single woman in the 1840s, which no single woman was getting on a boat and hanging out by herself. And while she was there, she met an Italian count. They had a baby. They forgot that get married part. And exactly. And then they decided to travel back to America. And just like Shelley, the boat she was traveling in sunk, and she and her husband and the baby all died. So she literally repeated Shelley's death as she had worshipped him all her life, which is so strange. The people who searched for her body, because it was right off the coast of New York, were Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, other transcendentalists who were great friends of hers. And that just sidetracked me into the Apple show Dickinson, which was about the life of Emily Dickinson, if you never saw it. Quite beautiful, and John Mulvaney played Thoreau in that. So it was quite a fun watch because they had Louisa May Alcott and Emerson, all these characters appeared inside that show to the young teenage Emily Dickinson. But Margaret comes to us after her love of Shelley. That takes us back to Lord Byron, again, part of the Shakespeare Code. She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies. And what I liked about it is Byron starts talking and then the doctor finishes it. Because she's like, you're not going to beat me at that stuff. And then he's all impressed she knows his work. She's like, no, everybody knows your work. Doesn't mean because he's flirting with her in the whole episode, which is quite adorable. And she keeps shutting him down, which nobody else was very good at because he was, as we know, quite the ladies' man. And this, of course, is the whole piece. What I liked was I found this fun picture of all the women in Byron's life. There were many. At the very end, it's actually his daughter, Ada Lovelace, which some people remember was the first woman to do computing, to do coding. And she appears in a Doctor Who episode as well, back in the Jodie era, so I think that's cool. And I love this episode because it ends on another Byron poem. And when they do the poem, it's about darkness, right? And the clouds perish. Darkness had no need of aid from them. She was the universe. And they end the episode on a close-up of the Doctor, so that essentially what we're saying is, this Doctor is the universe. And I've always, of course, loved the Jodie Doctor. Very pleased to have seen a recent interview, or not so recent, a little bit ago, where she reminded everybody that she's the only actress to ever portray the character who had two hearts inside her because she's pregnant when she did it. It's like, very interesting, very true. Nobody else is going to be able to bring that to the character. So
Take that, Tom Baker.
exactly. But I do love that moment. I think it's quite beautifully handled. They do that very pretty. Funny enough, guess who's not quoted in the Mary Shelley episode? Mary Shelley. There are no quotes from Mary Shelley in an episode built around her, except this one. She mentions the Cybermen as the modern Prometheus. And that is the actual title of Frankenstein, which we don't really use much anymore. We're so used to the films Frankenstein and all the cartoon characters, but it was really Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus. And so this is the one phrase of hers that is used in that episode. I thought that was funny, though, an episode built around her and it doesn't mention her. For Sorcerer's Stone, exactly, switching them out. It's so funny. Of course, then I wanted to bring myself up to Shooty's era because we want to celebrate that too. And I thought, well, I wonder if they've had any quotes. And again, this isn't something that I knew before doing the research, so that's always the fun of the research. There's the beautiful moment in Boom where what he says is, what survives of us is love, which is beautiful. And I was like, well, that's really pretty. Almost any TV writer could have written that, but did they? Where might that have come from? And in fact, it comes from this poem by this guy, Philip Larkin. It's called An Arundel Tomb. Similar to Ozymandias, he was looking at the tomb of some people from the past who are holding hands. You can't quite see it in this picture, but the way the tomb is designed, the husband and wife are holding hands in death. And he just thought about the love that that represented and wrote this poem, which then Stephen Moffat referenced in Boom, which I think is very cool. And Philip Larkin made a sidetrack from Doctor Who because there's recently been a movie about his life called Love Again, and it stars Hugh Bonneville, who we know from the pirate episode of Doctor Who. So all things come back to Who, no matter what you're doing, which I think is cool. Now, one of the things that I always like to remind people is that even the writers on the show came up with beautiful things that have become memes on the internet and we've seen done over and over again. So I just wanted to take a moment and reference a couple. Obviously, I love Russell. So in Tooth and Claw, he had this great bit about we're in a library, books are the best weapon in the world, which is a great idea and a great thought for all of us. Also, I thought this was a very beautiful piece in Thin Ice. Human progress isn't measured by industry, it's measured by the value you place on a life, an unimportant life, a life without privilege. The boy who died on the river, that boy's value is your value. That's what defines an age. That's what defines a species. It's awfully beautiful. And I looked at that, they got that from nowhere. They made that up. And this is in the era of, as we moved into Capaldi and Jodie, we started to get more female writers on the show, which is a big deal because they'd noticed in the earlier eras of Who, they hadn't had very many female writers. So I love to recognize the work of a woman writer. But also, who didn't love Peter's last speech? Such a beautiful thing to say, right? I think such a beautiful thing. The basic stuff first. Never be cruel, never be cowardly, never ever eat pears. Because you have to be funny, right? You have to make sure while I'm giving you a lesson, you take it with that little bit of sugar, right? But remember, hate is always foolish and love is always wise. Such a beautiful ending speech. This, I think, is probably my favorite Doctor regeneration speech of all of them. And I like Peter very much. Mostly I like Peter because of Torchwood, but that's okay. It's a whole other sidetrack on Torchwood, right? And of course, I loved that when they came to Demons of the Punjab, they had this very beautiful wedding speech, which I have now read people have been using at their own weddings. So that is a piece that will go down through history that Vinjay Patel wrote. But again, love in all its forms is the most powerful weapon we have because love is a form of hope. And like hope, love abides in the face of everything. Right? I think that's the prettiest thing. They both found love with each other. You believed in it, you fought for it, and you waited for it. So now you're committing to it, which makes you two right now the two strongest people on this planet, maybe in the whole universe. I think that's beautiful. And I can imagine seeing that at modern day kids' weddings. So that's going to go down in history in the same way some of those songs get repeated at weddings over and over again. All right, well, that brings me to what I wanted to do. If we have a moment, I wanted to do Michael, because I mentioned, and this will be on the screen. It'll be the sound from my computer, but I think he's quite lovely doing Do Not Go Gentle in That Good Night.
Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. The wise men at their end know dark is right. Because their words had fought no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learned too late they grieved it on its way. Do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men near death, who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
Isn't he brilliant?
Wasn't there another speech he did for a soccer team? The one on Graham Norton?
Yes, yes.
It was just...
So amazing. Exactly, exactly.
I don't know what the poem is, but there was something
go
that he
find
did
that.
for the soccer team. And
That's right.
It was just that same type of...
Oh, exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
It just got everything stirred up.
He's so brilliant, and he just never got to be a doctor. And then I wanted to end on this because I love to see a woman be brilliant, and this is Judi Dench. Sure.
He does appear in Doctor Who.
Who's he? He does. He's.
The voice of Father in the Doctor's Wife.
That's right. That's right. That's one. That's right. I forgot about that. I have to make that note. See, I tell you, you can't know everything. I like this one.
When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy contented least, yet in these thoughts myself almost despising, haply I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. For thy sweet love remembered, such wealth brings, that then I scorned change my state with kings.
Wow.
I loved when I saw that one because they just said, "Can you do any Shakespeare off the top of your head?" She said, "Well, what would you like?" He's like, I don't know, a piece of something." And then she's like, "Well, I'll do a sonnet." And he's like, "It's like having a Shakespeare jukebox." And she obviously does go right off the top of her head. And then there's a moment where Arnold Schwarzenegger says, Those are more words than in any of my movies. Which is there. Well, there you have it then. I wanted to look at all the literary things that were given to us from Doctor Who, and I hope that you guys enjoyed seeing all the stuff we've learned along the way. Thank you so much for coming.
Absolutely.
Very fun, very fun. That's a